Hello, students. This week you are learning about ancient Roman social classes. The main two groups of people were the patricians, they would have been the wealthiest people, and the plebeians, they would have been the common people. They would have been artisans, shopkeepers, farmers, things like that, regular common people. Patricians and plebeian men were both Roman citizens. They had the right to vote, to pay taxes, and to serve in the army. At one point, plebeians felt that they were not being treated well. They felt that they were doing all of the work and not getting all of the rights, especially in government, that the patricians had. And so they kind of left town and had a revolt and said, until you give us rights, we're not going to be doing things for you. And so before the revolt, things like marriage between patricians and plebeians was against the law. Plebeians did not have the right to hold office. After the revolt, the plebeians actually got to participate in government. They had the Council of Plebs or Tribune, where they were able to speak out about the laws in government. They could pass laws. They were able to have representatives in the law. And after the revolt, patricians and plebeians could get married. In ancient Rome, women did not have as many rights, but they could own land, they could run businesses, they could buy and sell property. Their main jobs would have been to manage the household and raise children, just like we would have seen in other civilizations. A key term called paterfamilias, where the father was the head of the Roman household. Again, that's something we would have seen in other civilizations as well. The ancient Romans had a lot of slaves. Slaves could buy their own freedom and they could become citizens. If they did not work hard or if they tried to run away, they would be punished. Their life was very hard and miserable. Sometimes they were made to fight to the death as gladiators. When we learned about stable food in the first week, we learned that rich people and poor people would have had different types of meals. So if you were rich, you would have had fancy banquets where you would have had parties with your friends over. You would have had the availability of lots of different spices to eat to kind of enhance the flavor of the food, where poor people would have had more of things like stews that would have been easier for them to get a hold of and eat. They had public baths where people would actually go, and that was a socializing event, kind of maybe like a mall would be today, where people went there. They had snacks, there were games, they even had libraries and music rooms. And so lots of people in Rome would have gone to the public bathhouses for socializations. Some information about how men and women dressed. So if you're interested in learning a little bit more about their clothing, that would be something to look at, how the different social classes dressed, as well as how men and women dressed. In ancient Rome, they did have a pretty large percentage of slaves. They're not sure of exact numbers, but they figure 20 to 30% of people. Again, slaves could buy their freedom. As we learned in other civilizations, slaves were often captured in times of war. So, as the Roman Empire expanded and they took over new territories and lands and they conquered those areas, they would turn some people into slaves. Criminals could also become slaves. People who owed money could become slaves. Again, just like we learned in other civilizations. Some slaves would have done hard labor. Others they found maybe worked in things like teaching or businesses. So your work as a slave would have depended probably on your previous experience, your previous jobs. That's how they would have decided what types of workers they would have had. They had public and private slaves. Public slaves would have worked for the government on things like building projects. Private slaves would have been owned by individuals and they would have worked in homes as servants or on farms or even as craftspeople. Depending on your owner as a slave would have depended on how well you were treated. Some slaves would have been treated well and they would have been paid for their work. Other slaves would not have been treated well and things would have been very harsh for them. Again, slaves could buy their freedom and sometimes they may have been set free by their owners. Freed slaves could be considered Roman citizens, but they could not hold public office. Some information that I found out about their life in the city of ancient Rome versus life in the countryside. Again, all part of being social classes. Roman cities were generally paved with stone. Many had raised sidewalks for people to walk on. The Roman cities had populations between 5,000 and 15,000. Cities were important to the empire because it was where the empire collected taxes. Wealthy Romans worked about 6-hour days from sunrise to about noon, and then they spent their afternoon kind of doing leisurely activities for entertainment. If you lived in the countryside, people often were involved in hunting. Food for the poor farmers was pretty boring, mainly things like beans and porridge. It is estimated that about 6 million sacks of grain each year were used to feed the population of Rome. The wives of poor farmers worked very hard from sun up to sun down. They spent their day doing chores, preparing food, and making clothes. The Romans lived in a wide variety of homes or houses depending on whether they were wealthy or poor. The poor lived in cramped apartments in the cities and in small shacks in the country. I also learned in some of my research that it was very easy to have the apartments burn down and catch fire in ancient Rome. So if you were a poor person, that was definitely something you had to worry about. Rich people lived in private homes in the city or in large villas in the country. Again, if you were interested in finding out about how people lived and what their homes would have been like, there's tons of information here about homes in the city, private homes, apartment buildings or the insulae where the poor people would have lived. Again, if you were wealthy and you lived in a private home, single family home, they would have been pretty fancy and these various items would have been in the house. Wealthy Romans also would have lived in villas. So if you want to learn a little bit more about that, how they lived, their homes would all be part of social classes. When Rome first started, everybody would have been a farmer. And as the farming got better, they wouldn't have needed as many farmers. They did have to learn to be, men had to learn to be in the army and be soldiers because the Roman Empire was so large and they were conquering a lot of areas, like in ancient Greece with Alexander the Great. As Rome developed and less people were needed for farming, they had specialization. That was a term we learned at the beginning of the year. So by the time they had specialization and Rome had developed into a republic, They had jobs like farmers, doctors, engineers, architects, teachers, shopkeepers, craftsmen, soldiers, sailors, fishermen, writers, poets, musicians, statesmen, and lots more. They also expanded to gladiators, charioteers, firemen, welfare workers. Again, as I said, because Rome was, especially the poor people, lived in pretty close quarters of apartments and they caught fire easily. That's why they would have had firemen. Some jobs were paid in basic needs like food and shelter. So if you had that type of job, your payment would have been a place to live and food to eat. Others would have been paid with actual money. They did have coins in ancient Rome. The plebeians would have worked all of the time, probably sun up till sundown, nonstop. Again, they would have been like farmers, merchants, craftspeople, regular, everyday working people. Patricians would have been the wealthy people. It would have been members of the higher class. They would have been politicians. They would have owned large estates and they would have had a more leisurely life where they would have worked part of the day and then they would have had part of the day to rest and relax, have get togethers with their friends because they would have had servants and workers who helped them do what their job needed them to do. I hope that you enjoyed learning about ancient Roman social classes. It's pretty similar to some of the other civilizations that we studied, but they had two main social classes, which would have been the patricians and the plebeians. Again, the patricians, the wealthy people, the plebeians, the common people. Make sure that you have your facts related to social classes, talking about the patricians, the plebeians, talking about how men, women, and children lived, talking about what their homes were like, so what the wealthy people lived like versus the common people. You could talk about the clothing of the wealthy versus the common people, the jobs, the homes. You could talk about education. So, social classes, how people lived in ancient times. I hope you learned a lot and have a great rest of the week. Pack up, clean up, check your AOR.